If you're confused by the Kentucky Derby picture, just wait until we start talking about the Kentucky Oaks. Let's talk about the top 10 fillies contending for this year's Kentucky Oaks. Salutations and welcome, friends. I'm your host to this very special episode of Kentucky Oaks Countdown. My name is Matthew DeSantis. You can find me on Twitter at the handle at Failed to Menace. Well, like I said, in this episode, we're going to run down the 10 top contenders for this year's Kentucky Oaks. And I got to tell you, it's a wide open field. But before we get to that, just a quick reminder if you haven't already, press that subscribe button here on Trust the Profits. We got a ton of content for you, whether you're interested in the Derby Trail, the Oaks Trail, whether you're interested in international racing, graded stakes racing, hanging out, live betting Thursday night on the lounge, whatever you're into, we have something for you. So make sure to press that subscribe button at the top. Make sure to give me a follow on Twitter at the handle at Failed to Menace. Well, like I said, the Kentucky Oaks picture has gotten even more confusing. It's funny, this past weekend when we looked at the Kentucky Derby picture, I think a lot of people would say it got a little more clear. Forte came back and reasserted himself in the division. You had a horse like Practical Move who made a statement out at Santa Anita. You had some of the big names start to assert themselves. You start to see a clear tier, I think, emerge in that Kentucky Derby picture. The Kentucky Oaks, though, wide open. The point I made last week, last year at this time, we knew who the big four were. And by the way, those big four pretty much so finished four of the top five in the Kentucky Oaks. We knew it was going to be Kathleen O. We knew it was going to be Secret Oath. We knew it was going to be Nest. We knew it was going to be Echo Zulu. We knew who the main competitors were at this point. And they had already established themselves. Echo Zulu, championship 2-year-old. Kathleen O was undefeated down at Gulfstream Park. You had Nest, who had just threw out a monster effort as a 3-year-old in the Suncoast at Tampa. And you had Secret Oath, who was getting ready to run against the boys. So we knew what we had with this 3-year-old filly crop last year. This year, though, wide open. And this past weekend did not provide any more clarity. You're going to see a number of horses from my list I had last week off the list. Why? Because a horse like Red Carpet Ready got pace compromised, might be distance compromised, and loses down at the Devonadale to a huge long shot in Darth Vader. You also have a horse like Asset Purchase, who again looked a little distance compromised up at the Busher Invitational. Then you have what's going on out west, which is always a little complicated because while we've been talking about the transfer Bob Baffert horses, we've not been focusing on that with the fillies. But in the Santa Isabel out there, which was a Kentucky Oaks prep on Sunday, Feza, his Bob Baffert's horse, wins that race, but that horse is not eligible for Kentucky Oaks points and is not eligible to be entered into the race. And therefore, you look at the second place horse, And Tell Me No Lies, a nice horse, but may not accumulate enough points to be able to qualify for the starting gate. We'll see. Peter Miller horse, I think is interesting to me, and Tell Me No Lies is probably just outside of this top 10 looking in, but I think a very capable filly, certainly. But let's take a look at this top 10 list, and what you're going to see is a slight change from what I did last week where I had these contenders. I'm going to still have your next race. I still have the column there showing you how many Kentucky Oaks points they have earned, but I'm also including that final column showing you what their futures odds are. The Kentucky Oaks futures pools are getting ready to open. And so that information I think is very helpful and provides you a little bit of clarity. But as you can see, a lot of these horses are all right around the same price. And that tells you that even the odds makers can't really differentiate between many of these horses. So if you like some of these horses, you might be able to get a huge price on a big winner eventually. But let's start at the bottom. Let's start at number 10. Who's a horse? It's interesting. Last week I had the horse Bandita at number 10. Moved her off the list. Why did I do that? She skipped now 2 straight works for Todd Pletcher. Not sure if there's a setback. Not sure if there's some issues there, but clearly things have gone a little bit awry for Bandita. I put in Money's Gold down there. Another Todd Pletcher horse. He's got plenty of them. down at the Gulfstream Park training facility. She's been logging regular works, obviously a Munnings baby. There's always a question about distance with those Munnings babies. Damn, out of Medaglia d'Oro. What I will say about this horse, has never routed before, has only sprinted. That said, has thrown up the two biggest speed figures that I believe this 3-year-old crop has seen overall this year for the fillies. And so she's thrown up two huge speed figures in her first two efforts, one at 5 furlongs, one at 6 furlongs. I mean, she looked completely untested at that distance against that competition. She's going to go up against stakes competition next time. The only question is whether or not she can handle the distance. Look for her to take that test at the Gulfstream Park Oaks. But she is a very, very impressive filly. Currently 30-1. Like I said, a little bit of the long shot. There are questions about distance. There's another filly up 2 spots that I'll talk about in a second, who is also untested at the stakes level, but has been tested at this distance. Well, let's move up to number 9, which is Who's Your Filly? And the bloom is a little bit off the rose for this filly. And I feel bad because she's had a real fall from grace. I mean, 3 weeks ago, she was 11-1 in Kentucky Derby futures. That's right, 11-1 in Kentucky Derby futures. People seem to have this whole narrative built out in their head about what she was going to do. She was going to go to the Rachel Alexandra and win that in convincing fashion, and then she was going to go and she was going to run in the Louisiana Derby, and she was going to beat the boys, and then she was going to go to the Kentucky Derby. Well, she bobbled at the start. She didn't look good at the Rachel Alexandra. She ended up finishing a very distant 3rd place. And now she's 15-1 futures for the Kentucky Oaks. Now, I think she's still a very talented filly, but I do think there's some questions here. She's an into Mischief filly, and I still think there's some questions about whether or not the rest of her crop has caught up to her a little bit. And this is a natural question to have. That was her first start as a 3-year-old. And there's always that maturation that takes place between 2 and 3. Some horses that are very precocious, they're going to pop big figures early. They're going to run really great as a 2-year-old, come back as a 3-year-old. Well, wait a second. They've not developed much. We saw this a little bit out of Echo Zulu last year. Echo Zulu was a champion 2-year-old, but you could tell maybe not quite as dominant as a 3-year-old. Ultimately moved her back to sprinting, which is where she's best, and I'm eager to continue to see her develop. But you see this sometimes with 2 to 3-year-olds. Who's Your Filly? I think still a very, very good filly, very capable. And if you were high on her earlier, you're now at least getting a little bit more of a price from a future standpoint for the Oaks. Now, the filly that I mentioned earlier that is also untested at the stakes level is Punch Bowl. And this is a Brad Cox horse who has registered 2 extremely impressive wins in a maiden and an allowance company. The reason I have Punch Bowl a little bit higher than I do Money's Gold, I know she can do the distance. That's the most important thing. She won stretching out at a mile and a 16th in that last effort. Brad Cox has a lot of very good fillies. He's got a lot of really good colts too in this 3-year-old crop. That's part of the reason I'm not sure where she's headed next. Is she going to stay down and run in the Fairground Oaks? If she is, she might run against the Alley's Look. She might run against Chop Chop. She might run against some of his other horses. Does she go up to the Fantasy in Keeneland, where potentially Wet Paint's going? Some questions about, again, where is she going? Is she going to the Ashland? Where is she going next? So that's a little bit of a question. Brad Cox, obviously, a lot of moving pieces in that barn. I think Chop Chop, who was not on this list, but was one of his fillies, I think probably headed back to the turf. That might clear things up and allow for Punch Bowl to have a little bit more of a clear option in terms of where she's going to run next. But 2 for 2, super impressive efforts both times. And considering the nature of this 3-year-old filly crop, there's no reason to think she can't get a stakes win and can't run one time in a prep race and get enough points to qualify for the Kentucky Oaks. Well, let's move to number 7 on my list, which is Sheeta Beauty. And Sheeta Beauty ran a beauty this weekend up in Aqueduct and won the Busher Invitational. Now, granted, it was a 1-turn mile and it was in the mud, so there are always some qualifications there. But she accumulated 50 Kentucky Derby points by winning and beating her stablemate Asset Purchase, who you'll see is not on the list anymore. I'll be honest, Asset Purchase looked distance compromised late in that race. It's just, that stride really started to shorten up. I'm not sure Asset Purchase wanted a mile, and I don't know what the future for Asset Purchase really holds. Asset Purchase, it should be pointed out, was a 4-5 favorite in that race and looked like she was well on her way to victory, and then just really flattened out down the stretch. Sheeta Booty seemed to really relish all the distance. Again, we'll see what it looks like around 2 turns, but her running style would suggest that she should like the 2 turns. Practical Joke filly, and like I said, very impressive when you see one barn mate beat another in the way that she did. Again, that always a lot of qualifications coming out of that New York circuit. The combination of a 1 turn mile, the combination of the conditions of the track, always a little bit of question marks. But I think Sheeta Beauty is a very good one, and you'll see that her future odds are 15-1, really stacking right up there with anyone. That's the other part. Going back to Punch Bowl for a second, you look at those futures odds 20-1 as opposed to Money's Gold 30-1. Tells you a little bit about the odds makers think. It also tells you kind of why I have Punch Bowl a little bit higher on the list than I do Money's Gold. Well, let's move to another Chad Brown horse, and that is Occult. And Occult, the reason I like Occult here is, and they're both going to go to this Gazelle, Sheeta Booty and Occult. The reason I like Occult, she's already done the distance. She's done the 9 furlongs in the Busanda. That, I think, is a huge factor. There are a lot of questions with these fillies. Do they want the distance? Are they going to do the 9 furlongs, etc.? I know the answer with Occult already. She can do that. So very impressive effort. The fact that she skips the Busher and is going to go straight to the Gazelle probably tells you everything you need to know about what Chad Brown thinks of this Into Mischief filly. And I think she is the class of that New York circuit. Question is, how is she against better competition? We'll find out, obviously, but I think she has solidified herself as the top New York filly in that circuit, and I'm looking forward to seeing her run against her stablemate in the Gazelle. Well, let's crack into the top 5 and let's move into number 5, Julia Shining. And she moved down my list a little bit. She was number 3 last week, moved her to number 5 this week. You might ask why I did that, because the top 5 did not race at all this last week. In fact, the top 6 did not race at all this past weekend. Part of it was just thinking about this more and more. Julia Shining never won a stakes race. Every single horse above her is a stakes winner. I think that matters. I think running against that level of competition, knowing what you're going to get out of a horse at that level of competition is important. And the other part is all of these horses have run in stakes competition and taken money. So they're not just long shots. You'll see a horse like Darth Vader, not there. Dreaming of Snow, not there. These are long shots who won Kentucky Oaks prep races, but in my opinion, not very likely to back it up next time out. Maybe a little bit like a horse like Raise Cane, for instance, who won the Gotham this weekend for the boys. So Julia Shining, though, listen, she's done nothing wrong in a lot of ways. She is 2 for 3 winning. Her first stakes attempt, she finished a very close up third in a track that really favored early speed. And she's not early speed. She's the full sister to Malathat, obviously the daughter of Curlin. And she is a horse that will take as much ground as you give her, but she doesn't have that stunning turn of foot. She's a grinder, much like her sister is in Malathat. And as a result, you need to really push her to run the whole way around the track. And that can be very exhausting for a jockey, I can only imagine. But it's also something where some of these shorter preps are probably not ideal. I think she probably will like 1 1/8 more than 1 1/16. And I think she'll like even more than 1 1/8 at some point. So she's certainly a very capable filly. But again, until I see her win at the stakes level, there's still going to be some questions there. Let's move to the number 4 horse on this list, a Brad Cox horse. This is the Alley's Look. And the Alley's Look, interesting horse. Beat Chop Chop last time out in the Silver Bullet Day. Now, Chop Chop comes back to run a nothing effort in the Rachel Alexandra. So maybe you say, well, that doesn't really do much. But here's the thing. The Alley's Look finished second her previous race in the Untappable to Pretty Mischievous, who comes back to win the Rachel Alexandra. So in that regard, she looks even better. So again, kind of an interesting, just trying to follow the running lines there between these horses. But the Alley's Look is a connect filly. I think I'm really high on her. I like her a lot. And I like her, obviously, I think a little bit more than the odds makers do, 15-1. I have her number 4 on my list. You see some other horses at 15-1 that are further down. But I think she's a very legitimate horse and a very legitimate filly here in this particular spot. She's also firing off some very nice works. She just fired off a bullet 1 minute and 1 5 furlong work on Saturday morning at the fairgrounds, first to 31 horses. She's ready to roll. And I'm going to be very excited to see what she does. I'm very high on the Alley's look. I think she's a really impressive filly. Look for her to continue to move up this list potentially. Now, pretty mischievous is my number 3 horse, and another horse for Brendan Walsh, another into mischief filly who really has done nothing wrong. 4 for 5 winning in her career. Only loss was a third place effort in the grade 2 Ashland to Hoosier filly, and that was as a juvenile. Has come back as a 3-year-old, won twice. Speed figures probably don't overwhelm you, although comparative to everyone else in the field, they're right there. Obviously, you can see she's got a ton of Kentucky Derby points. She's already locked in her starting place in the starting gate of the Kentucky Oaks. But she's back on the workout tab as well, which I really like to see after that Rachel Alexandra. She's also a horse that really, I was so impressed by that Rachel Alexandra because the horse was on the lead and was kind of lone speed, and she just tracked that lone speed down and really kind of grinded away, looked her in the eye and got past her. Again, I talk about this with the boys all the time. It's applicable with the girls too. I like horses that show guts. I like horses that dig in and go, you're not getting by me, or guess what? I am going to get by you. And I see that out of Pretty Mischievous. I like that mentality. I like Brendan Walsh a lot as a trainer. That's why she's number 3 on my contenders list. Well, let's move to the future's favorite, actually, who's number 2 on my list, Wonder Wheel. Of course, the reigning juvenile champion for the fillies from last year's Breeders' Cup for Mark Casse. We'll see where she runs next. Maybe goes down to the Gulfstream Park Oaks because she ran in Tampa Bay last time. Maybe goes to the Fairground Oaks because Casse runs a lot of horses in that Louisiana circuit. So we'll see where she ends up going. But, again, much like Julia Shining, she was in a tough spot last time out in that Sun Coast. It was a very forward favoring track that day. She still ran very, very well to finish second. She's not really done anything wrong. She has a ton of versatility, can win on the lead, can win coming from way off the lead. Has one coming as far back from 11th place to win. She also wired the field. So again, a lot of versatility there. You always have to like that out of horses. Casse continues to rave about this horse, says it is the best horse he has in his barn, best filly he's ever trained. So there's a lot of praise there for this Into Mischief filly, Wonder Wheel. I have her number 2, but I certainly understand if other people have her number 1. But part of me wants to see her win a stakes race at 3 years old before I anoint her as the number 1 contender. Like I said, there were some excuses last time, but still want to see her get across the finish wire first. And it was interesting. I was kind of really out on her going into that Breeders' Cup Juvenile fillies because she just barely held on in the race before that, wiring the field. So it wasn't an overwhelming effort, but that effort in the juvenile was just so good. And we'll see if she can replicate that now as a 3-year-old. Certainly super talented. Well, let's move to the top horse on the list, which is a Blame filly, wet paint, who likes wet surfaces and is the leader in the clubhouse. She won the Martha Washington. She won the Honeybee at Oaklawn. Both of those races were in the slop. She can handle 2 turns. She can come from off the pace. She can close into other horses, and she can fly once she gets moving. She is going to be going to that fantasy next at Oaklawn Park. She clearly likes that track a lot. We'll see if she's weather dependent. One of the conditions that you have to pay attention to is the fact that other than those 2 dirt efforts, which were both on sloppy sealed tracks, her 2 other efforts were on synthetic and turf. She's never run on a dry, fast track. That's something to keep in mind as you look ahead for what could be in the Kentucky Oaks this year. But I like her a lot. I think she can really run. She's got impressive running style. It may not play out great in bigger fields, although that last field in the Honeybee was a good size and she wove her way through traffic just fine and got there at the end. Like I said, very high on this filly. She's number 1 on my list, but this feels like a very wide open Kentucky Oaks field this year of contenders. And we are going to be coming back every single week with new lists of Kentucky Oaks contenders, give you some updates when they come across in terms of who's training, who's not. Are there any injuries to report? Do we know where these fillies are going to be pointed? Obviously, you see people like Chad Brown, Todd Pletcher, Brad Cox having multiple contenders in this field. Going to be very, very interesting. Also interesting to pay attention to what's happening out in California because, again, Bob Baffert is running Feza and kind of eating up points that cannot be used in the Kentucky Oaks because the winner's, not going to get any points because it's trained by Bob Baffert. So those underneath fillies out in California, the and Tell Me No Lies of the world, who are finishing second and third in those Oaks preps out in California, how does that translate? Can't beat Feza, but maybe that's not a bad thing. I remember a couple years ago, I was out on a horse like Medina Spirit because couldn't beat Life is Good. Well, Medina Spirit proved he could absolutely beat horses. And just Life is Good was a monster. That's all the only thing that I proved. And so Feza, same sort of thing. You have to pay attention to those horses finishing underneath. So we'll have more information for you as we get going. Well, thank you so much for tuning in today. Make sure to press that like button. Let us know who your top 3 favorites are for this year's Kentucky Oaks. Make sure to subscribe to Trust the Profits. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at the handle at Failed to Menace. Well, until next time, friends, my name is Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a great and profitable day at the track and reminding you that it's now post time.